Did you know that in Lightroom there's a simple way to add punch to your photos, adding some color to different areas of your photos that's independent of white balance and your normal tonality changes, and it's really simple to understand and easy to apply. It's called split toning. Now it's a lot easier to show you what this is than to try to explain everything all at once. So let's just take a look at a picture here. This is a photo that I shot in Panama. It looks pretty good. I've already done all of my white balance adjustments, all of my tonality changes. But what I want to do is I want to flavor this image. I want to add a little bit more flavor to the highlight area. I want to add some color to that and a different color to the shadow area. And so look, that's the subtle change. So here's before. Look at the clouds, look at the darkness in the water. When I go to the after photo, now you can see there's more magenta in this, there's more blue in the shadow area. That's sort of a subtle change. Some people might think it's actually a little bit too much for this image, but let me explain this in terms that are a little bit easier to understand. So what split toning is it allows you to say, hey, I want to take a color, any color in the spectrum, I want to inject that color into the highlights of my image. Or I want to take a color, any color, I want to take that color and inject that into the shadows of my image. Or you can do both at the same time. That's the split tone. So maybe we'll have some ambers or oranges in the highlights and blues in the shadows, and we can flavor our image that way, either subtly or really dramatically. Let me show you exactly how this works, and then we'll get to how you apply it to a realistic image. This is a photo that I shot somewhere in Paris. It's just a glass ceiling here. And the reason I chose this image is because we have this highlight area here, these windows, and then we have a lot of shadows over here on the other side. So what I'll do here to show you how split toning works is I'm going to go to the Develop module and then over to split toning. Now notice in split toning we really have 5 sliders. We have a section for the highlights, and we can choose the hue, in other words, which color we want to apply, and then the saturation, how much of that color we want to apply, and the same thing for the shadows. The hue, in other words, which color do we want to throw into the shadows, and then how much of that color we want to throw into the shadows. And then we have this other slider here called balance that I'll explain later. Now, when you first start out, if you're going through this and sliding these sliders back and forth, you'll see that nothing is happening if I go through the hue there because my saturation is set to 0. So to see what's happening, you need to take that saturation and increase that. I'll go all the way to 100% so we can see. And now as I move my highlights around, you can see that whatever color I choose, whatever hue, it's being injected into my highlights. There's another way to choose the color, by the way, and that's just to click on that little square there, and then you can use your color picker to choose the hue and the saturation all at one time. So notice this is in my highlights. I'm going to choose bright red here so that we have something that's really noticeable. And in the shadows here, I'm going to go and choose a really deep blue. And now notice, we have our shadows have this deep blue. Our highlights have this red. I can take that shadow saturation down, bring it up. The same thing with the highlights. This isn't really practical. It's just sort of helping us understand the principles of split toning. What does the balance slider do? Well, the balance slider helps us understand how much of the image is considered in our highlights and how much is in our shadows. So right now it's saying in the middle at 0, the balance is equal. So what's normally considered a shadow is a shadow. What's normally considered a highlight is a highlight. But as we shift that balance over, we're saying, hey, take more, expand those highlights to put more of that color there, or expand the shadows. So we're expanding one or the other. So we can see that down here. If I'll slide this balance slider to the right, I'm saying, hey, take and allow more of the image to be considered a highlight. And you can see our red is growing, our highlights are growing. Or to the left, consider more of the image to be a shadow and see that the blue is expanding. So you can sort of play with the balance between those highlights and shadows. And remember, you don't have to do both at the same time. If I just want my highlights to be highlighted with red, I can just take the saturation on the shadows down, and it's only the highlights that we're seeing there, and we can still play with that. Okay, now that's the principle. What does this actually do in a real photo? Something that's something we might want to do. Well, I'm going to open up an image here. This is a shot that I took in Nepal, and the color looks great. Everything looks pretty good with this. But notice that in our highlights here, in the clouds, we've got this golden sun peeking through right here in this area, but the rest of the highlights, they're just sort of neutral color. They're just normal clouds. And what I'd like to do is say, hey, you know what? I just want those to be a little bit warmer. I want my highlights to have a tone that matches that same section. So I'll go down here to the highlights, click on this, and I'm going to choose something that's a little bit yellowish, something like that. And then I can play with that to get the exact tone that I want. And notice now I'm having the highlights match that area. So I'm not changing the color temperature, I'm not doing anything to that foreground, all that green. I'm just saying, hey, in the highlights, let's inject a little bit more of that golden color to match that sun coming through. And then I can play with that saturation to make it a little bit more subtle or dramatic, however I want to do that. And so that's one way that you can just use that for scenic photography. Let's go to a different image here, and I'm going to grab this image that I shot here in Panama. And again, this looks pretty darn good. But what I want to do is I want to add some tones to this. I want to take these foreground, these dark areas, and make them a little bit more magenta bluish, and then take these clouds and make them look a little bit more golden. So in my highlights here, I've chosen a more golden highlight, and see as I'm warming that up, the whole sky, everything that's a highlight becomes more golden. And then I've chosen down here a little bit more of a bluish, and then I'll bring that into the shadows, and that adds a little bit of a magenta there. And so you can see I'll turn that off. That's before, it looks pretty good. After, now that's got some more golden color, and you can see the highlights over here look a little bit more golden. Up here it looks a little bit more golden. So I can tone that image in a way that looks a little bit more pleasing to me, either subtly or dramatically, it doesn't matter. Now we can also do things. Let's take a monochromatic looking image. Here's one that was in a recent episode of Exploring Photography. This is the shot I did with my long lens of the Andes Mountains. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this and give it a little bit more flavor. So these highlights here, I'm going to add in, again, a little bit more amber. So I'm going to go over here, bring in some amber. That looks pretty good. And I want my shadows to be a complementary color. So I'm going to bring in some blues. So I'm going to just add that right there. So I'll move that over. There we go. And you can play with that until you get that to look exactly as you want. Now, one thing that's very important to understand is that this layer, sort of like a layer, not an actual layer, but it's sort of a layer that's floating above all of the colors and white balance and everything that you've done underneath to your image. And so the hue, the saturation slider, all those sliders that you normally work with colors don't affect this split tone that you're adding. Let me just show you that. So I'm going to go up here on the same exact image. I'm going to grab my presence here and take the saturation down to 0. And notice I still have that bluish tone to my shadows. If I take the saturation all the way up, I still have the bluish tone in my shadows. And so the underlying image is getting more or less saturated, but the stuff that I've done on top with my split tone stays the same. It's not affected by this. Even if I go and change that to a black and white, I still have my split tone that's working. And so that is something that's really important to understand. The split tone is independent of those saturation and the other sliders in the presence area. So your vibrance and saturation, your clarity, etc. They are independent of that, and that's really, really cool. So if you really want to do a quick change to the highlights, maybe give them a little bit more of a warm tone or a cool tone, or the same thing in the shadows, you can do that without affecting everything else. And that's one of the advantages of this. The other thing you can do, one more image. Here's an image that I shot in Paris. It's the famous Moulin Rouge. It looks pretty good, but it's totally red. There's a lot of red to this. I want some complementary colors. So what I can do, this is the color temperature that I want, but I want to make this a little bit more punchy. So I'm going to go into my shadows here, and I'm going to add in a bunch of green. I'm going all the way to 100%. And notice that brings out all this stuff underneath the sign, underneath the Moulin Rouge sign. But I want my highlights also to have a little bit more punch as well. So I'm going to add in some amber. Now notice here is before, looks okay. After, now we have a much punchier, more contrasty color scheme. So we've got our greens and our reds that are contrasting, and that really makes this a much more interesting photo to look at. So you set your tonality, you set your white balance, you get everything set, and then you add this extra layer of split toning to add something either to the shadows or the highlights or both at the same time. And I think you'll see that you get some really interesting effects. Now the other thing you can do with this filter here is you can make things look a little bit Instagrammy. So we have this dog here. I shot, I think, in Baños, Ecuador. And what I want to do is I want to take the dark areas here, make them really blue. So I'll do that. Take the white, the highlights, make them a little bit more orange. And so there you go. Now you have something that looks a little Instagrammy. If you want to change up what's happening, again, you can use the balance to change that. Or if you want to change your highlights and shadows, then you can just do that in your develop module, and that will also allow you to do some really cool things. So you can get some of those Instagrammy kind of looks. It's split toning. It's really easy to use. It's really fun. Play with it. Try to do some things that are really dramatic. Try to do some things that are very subtle. And I think you'll see that cityscapes, scenic photos, all of those kinds of things can really have some flavor that you can't just get by adjusting the white balance and using different filters and things like that. So check it out, split toning. It can really help your photography quite a bit. Hey, don't forget to check out the Adorama Learning Center. It's got a new look. If you haven't seen it recently, you should check it out. It's really awesome. It's absolutely free. And don't forget to subscribe to Adorama TV. That way you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.